Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Russia is warning Finland and Sweden that there would be, as it puts it, serious military and political consequences should they join NATO. Finland says the decision is its alone. As the Nordic country watches Russia's troop build-up on the Ukrainian border, has Russia's threat backfired and actually pushed Finland closer to NATO? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. There is no sense of Finland imminently applying for NATO membership, but Russia's military aggression towards Ukraine and its desire for Finland not to join the pact has fired up an internal debate in Helsinki to a level last seen after Moscow's annexation of Crimea. Following talks with the Finnish president, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg tweeted, "We call on Russia to de-escalate. We continue to coordinate with our close partner, Finland. NATO respects the right of every country to choose its own path." Finland has long been a country that prides itself on neutrality. However, some politicians, including Green Party members, are now speaking more positively about NATO membership. Could NATO end Finland's neutrality? According to NATO, Finnish cooperation with NATO is based on its policy of military non-alignment and a firm national political consensus. And Finland is one of NATO's most active partners and has been a contributor to NATO-led operations and missions in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Finland is one of a few European nations that did not significantly cut its military strength after the end of the Cold War. It shares a 1,340-kilometre border with Russia. A 2015 Gallup poll showed that 74% of Finns said they would be willing to use weapons to defend their country, a higher proportion than in other European countries. Let us first of all travel to Finland, to the capital, Helsinki, in fact, and we welcome Henri Vanhanen, Foreign Policy Advisor at the National Coalition Party in that country. We go to the UK. And welcome Keir Giles, author of Waking the Neighbour, Finland, NATO and Russia, and to Scotland, to Glasgow, in fact. Jamie Shea joins us from there, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. The most obvious question, I think, and I'll go to you first of all, Henri, if I may, is do you in Finland, not you personally, but the country, believe that Russia is a threat?
In Finland, we do recognize the concern, especially in European security at the moment, where we see a perhaps more assertive Russia willing to use military means to advance its political goals. So, of course, every violation of international law and the usage of military force, of course, is considered threatening in Finland, to say the least.
And does that push Finland logically closer to NATO?
Well, it is one of the reasons. If we consider Finland's NATO membership, it's, I would say, 3 points come into play, and of course the most important one being Russia and its aggressive behavior. If Russia continues to deteriorate the overall security situation in Europe, the possibilities for Finland joining NATO will of course increase. The second one, of course, is the domestic support, which right now the majority of Finns oppose the membership. And the third factor, of course, would be if Sweden decided to join NATO. So these things kind of create the dynamics around Finland's NATO policy right now.
Yeah, I recognise what you're saying about the majority opposing it. I think it's 24%, but it's gone up in the last couple of years from 20%. In Sweden, I think it's double that number, and the support for NATO membership, possible NATO membership, is continuing to rise in Sweden. So points well made. Keir, let me come to you first of all. What does Russia make of all of this?
Well, Russia's position has been completely unchanged throughout all the time that we've been observing it. And a lot of the threats that we're hearing now laid down in the draft treaties that Russia's proposing to the West are really just the written form of things that Russia has been agitating for a long time. The basic problem that Finland has is that Russia sees any increase in the security of its neighbors as actually being a problem for Russia, because it means that Russia can't have its way with them as it would wish to. Now, you mentioned the book, Waking the Neighbour, Finland, NATO and Russia, where I wrote at some length about Finland's NATO option and whether it actually made sense to join NATO in the face of increasing threats from Russia. The interesting thing is that was written now 13 years ago in 2009, but since then, actually, very little has changed. All of the external factors that would make Finland decide whether to join NATO or not haven't actually changed. Back in 2008, we were writing about this in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Georgia, and it was already plain that Russia does use military force as a means to get its foreign policy objectives met, and that it does not act by the norms that are common to the rest of Europe. So the problem and the challenge was already clear at that point. And in terms of the domestic support that you asked Henri about, what we've seen, again, over that period in between is a steady ticking up of domestic support. The basic paradox and the real irony of this, of course, is that Russia wants to threaten countries into not joining NATO. But everything that Russia does to try to do that just convinces those countries more how much they need NATO.
One of the things that you wrote more recently, which I was interested in, was an article for Chatham House, and you say Russia's trying to panic the West into rolling back its own security as a preferable alternative to open warfare. So is this blustering from Russia's part?
It's blustering, but it's backed up by the realization that actually, yes, Russia is perfectly willing to use the forces that it has at its disposal, as we've seen in Georgia and in Crimea and in Syria. And let's not forget further back in time in the wars around Russia's periphery that came at the end of the USSR. The problem is this very different attitude to military force between Russia's leaders and Europe's leaders, where Russia can rely on European leaders trying to avoid or end conflict as rapidly as possible, instead of trying to make sure that any kind of confrontation actually arrives at some kind of solution that is even vaguely acceptable. The big problem is, in every single case that we've seen, all of those examples that I've mentioned, the Western powers want to end the fighting, but Russia instead wants to win the war. And now it's leveraging that by making these military postures, by threatening to invade Ukraine or to carry out other measures against other neighbors in order, as you said, to panic those Western leaders into reaching some kind of accommodation to meet all of those Russian demands that ought to be completely unacceptable.
Jamie, what does NATO make of the idea of Finland, possibly Sweden, joining the alliance?
Well, NATO, of course, is very open to Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, but NATO doesn't, David, go recruiting new member states. It relies upon those countries themselves to come to Brussels and to say we would like to join. Although the NATO Secretary General was recently in both Stockholm and Helsinki, he's always wary not to be seen to be interfering in the domestic political debate or giving Sweden and Finland the impression that somehow they're coming under sort of direct NATO pressure to join the alliance. They have to have a political consensus. That's been referred to already, but they have to have consistent public support. Both those elements, as previous panelists point out, have been lacking in recent years. But frankly, NATO gets a very, very good deal out of the existing relationship with those two countries. They are big contributors to a lot of what NATO has been doing, peacekeeping in the Balkans, troops in Afghanistan. They participate in many NATO military formations, like the NATO Response Force. In Helsinki, the Finns are even hosting a large EU-NATO centre dealing with hybrid warfare, and they contribute a lot in these areas like resilience, for example, cybersecurity, and so on, because of course they've also experienced some of those interference operations by Russia in the same way that NATO countries have done. At the same time, when I was at NATO, we had daily interactions with Sweden and Finland, and it was clear that they were mapping out the path to possible NATO membership. Both countries had commissions that came to NATO to inquire about what membership would involve, how much would it cost, what the legal arrangements would be. So they've sort of prepared the ground in terms of that and in terms of interoperability with NATO to be able to jump into the alliance very painlessly and very quickly if they decide to cross that Rubicon. But David, final point here, I think that frankly for both those countries, countries, the current situation has been rather comfortable for them. EU membership, non-alignment, which politically has worked so well for them, closeness to NATO, being seen to be active contributors, but without provoking Russia by going, as I said, across that Rubicon into formal NATO membership.
This is the one thing I wanted to ask you about.
They would feel that they would want to disturb that comfortable relationship if the threat from Russia is such.
This is the point, surely, Jamie, isn't it? You say NATO might welcome Sweden and Finland, but wouldn't it also be very wary of poking that angry Russian bear?
Well, the Russians seem to be focused much more on former Soviet Union states, particularly Ukraine and Georgia at the moment, and preventing that from happening. Maybe they've also believed that it was not likely that Finland and Sweden would seek NATO membership, as I said, because the post-Cold War arrangements have been very comfortable for these two countries themselves. But I think Keir Giles put it very well when he said that obviously the more Russia is seen to be denying the prospect of membership to those two countries, the more they themselves are raising it. I thought it was very interesting that President Niinisto of Finland, who, from my experience at NATO, was a great bridge builder between Putin and NATO, particularly, for example, in trying to suggest confidence-building measures on military exercises and those kind of things, has now, in his New Year address, raised the prospect of NATO membership.
Henry, I will come back to you in just a moment, but since Jamie's brought up the former Soviet republics, I want to go to Keir on that and Russia's possible expansionist ideas. If we take a look at a map and come from Finland southwards, we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Jamie mentioned Ukraine, then Moldova and Georgia, where we know both in Ukraine and Georgia there have been losses of life because of what Russian troops have done there. Do you think Russia's saying, when it launches these kinds of attacks, don't you dare come any closer?
Well, that's certainly the way Russia would like us to think about the current treaty proposals, the current demands that it's presenting, accompanied by menaces to Ukraine. But Russia's actually been very successful in presenting something which is far more palatable to the world than what they're actually demanding for when they come to the United States and NATO. Yes, it looks as though what they're talking about is no further NATO enlargement eastwards, and that covers any country that's neighboring Russia, whether it is Ukraine or Finland or anywhere else. But if you look at what they're actually demanding on top of that, it is the opposite of Russia looking for security guarantees for themselves. They're actually looking for rolling NATO's security guarantees backwards to where they were effectively at the end of the Cold War. And that's a very different proposition, and one which is not talked about enough in the West when we're discussing these proposals. Because no further NATO enlargement, although, as Jamie says, NATO does keep an open door, and so it would not be an acceptable thing to agree to in the first place, is still a great deal more palatable than what Russia is asking for, which is taking NATO away from those countries that lie in between. One of the biggest problems that we have is Russia's perception of NATO and its persistent failure or probably refusal to understand what NATO is. Now, Jamie just said that NATO doesn't go recruiting. That's not how Russia sees it. First of all, they think that NATO, like Russia would, drags countries into itself by force and by threats. We've heard President Putin talking about, as he put it, NATO's dangerous attempts to seize Ukrainian territory. And second, they also think that it's actually the United States that is in charge, the United States that runs NATO in the same way that Moscow used to run the Warsaw Pact. They think it's an equivalent. Look again at the text of these draft treaties. It says very specifically there that the United States should prevent any further members joining NATO, when in fact it's not a US decision. So in so many ways, the current conversation that we're having is not about what Russia is really looking for, which is moving back to the time when the Soviet Empire and the Tsarist Empire before it had this dominion over vast areas of Eastern Europe that now are sovereign and independent nations and would quite like to stay that way.
Okay. Henry, as promised, I'm going to come to you now to get Finland's position. This is something that we heard after the NATO-Russia meeting in Brussels last week. This from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia.
We treat with great care the choice made by countries that follow the policy of military non-alignment. And they are aware of the caring attitude and we assume that this is in everyone's interest to keep the regional configuration as it is.
Henri, does Finland take that as a threat?
As mentioned by Keir, these demands are not limited just only to Georgia or Ukraine. Obviously, when Russia speaks of NATO's so-called expansion, it is referring to Finland and Sweden as well. But at the same time, we have to be aware that the reason why Russia doesn't want to name Finland as directly as it does, for example, Ukraine or Georgia, is that, or Sweden, is that it doesn't want to push them more towards the potential membership. It understands that, for example, right now we are having a very vivid and unprecedented national debate on security policy, including NATO membership. So therefore, Russia understands that if it pushes too much, it can actually lead into the exact opposite result it actually was in the first time trying to achieve.
But do you think Finland would be more afraid if it were to become a member of NATO, despite the fact that NATO has incredible force behind it, but because of the danger that would pose as Russia sees it? Might it be counterproductive for Finland to do that?
Well, if we look at what NATO could provide to Finland, what added value it could bring to Finland being a member of NATO is that it's of course deterrence through NATO's joint defense planning and Article 5, and this of course would be the main reasons for Finland to improve its security beforehand. But it should be remembered that it's not just what NATO could offer to Finland, but what Finland would bring to the table as well. I mean, from a military point of view, there are no impediments to Finland joining NATO, and the Finnish armed forces are implementing allied standards. They are characterized by a high level of interoperability with NATO countries. And in addition, Finland already has a strong national defense in the context of Northern Europe, a wartime strength of 280,000 soldiers, and has maintained a capable national defense way throughout the period of the post-Cold War era. And of course, in December, Finland also made the decision to procure 64 F-13 fighters from the United States. And of course, we must understand that from NATO's perspective, Finland's military capabilities and geostrategic location between the Arctic and the Baltic Sea would naturally strengthen the alliance and security of the northeastern flank, including the defense of Baltic states and northern Norway, as well as, of course, improve NATO's intelligence capabilities regarding the Russian Kola Peninsula. And all of this means that Finland is seen already by now by NATO as an interesting and capable partner for defense cooperation in Northern Europe, and that Finland would, if it joined NATO, bring additional value to the alliance's collective security. And in this sense, Finland is not a consumer of security, but rather a producer of security.
And of course, there are trade ties that Finland has with Russia. We can get into those a little bit later. If you would like to, Jamie, let me come to you. The same quote I'm going to ask you about, the one from Alexander Grushko. It is in everyone's interest to keep the regional configuration as it is. We treat with great care the choice made by countries. Would NATO see that as a threat to those that would like to get closer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Well, I think that what NATO wants to do is to preserve the sort of post-Cold War settlement, which was a different Europe where countries were free to join organizations or not join organizations, just like Sweden and Finland have chosen to join the EU but not NATO, and where small states sat at the table to discuss their future with big states, and where the big states no longer made deals on spheres of influence or buffer zones over their heads. This was a great advance at the time, and this is what Putin is now pushing back against, with this idea that in fact it's the large countries which dictate what happens to the small. Big powers are entitled to their spheres of influence and can lay down red lines and diktats. The problem, I think, was very well summarized, David, some years ago by Henry Kissinger, talking about the Soviet Union, when he said that absolute security for the Soviet Union means absolute insecurity for everybody else. In other words, what Russia has come up with these proposals is a set of massive demands on the West to roll back NATO's frontiers back to the pre-enlargement, pre-1997 period, to basically removed the security guarantees from 50% of its member countries to take out its deterrent nuclear weapons, American forces, and all of it. In fact, it's not just the end of the Eastern Europeans' membership of NATO, it's tantamount to the end of NATO itself. But what is Russia offering in return? Not even to withdraw its forces away from the Ukrainian border. So unfortunately, what Grushko is expressing is a very, very one-sided, Russia gets everything and the rest get nothing sort of arrangement. And I think the Russians know perfectly well that something like that is not negotiable for the NATO countries. But just if I may briefly, one further point on Finland. I think we're in an interesting period now where Finland and Sweden have come very close to integrating into NATO, everything except the Article 5 defence commitment, all of the interoperability that Henrik very well summarised. But they've also seen from the experience of Ukraine that you can be a very, very, very strong partner of NATO and have a lot of interoperability. But if you're not actually a NATO member, you're not going to have the assurance that NATO coming to your defence.
So, the silence has been pretty deafening.
The marriage that provides security, and that's really the difficult choice that both countries, I think, now have to confront.
Yeah. The Article 5, just for our viewers who don't get it, that's where if a NATO member is attacked, then the other NATO countries guarantee to defend it. And you were saying that neither Ukraine nor obviously at the moment Sweden or Finland are allied to that, and therefore they don't get that kind of protection. Keir, going back to the book you wrote, 13 years ago, but we're talking about centuries here, Waking the Neighbour, about what Finland's relationship is with Russia. You point out that the West just doesn't understand the Russian psyche. So do you think the West is wrong here to think that Russia could be geographically expansionist?
Absolutely not. Russia does aspire to expanding its territory or expanding its control by any means possible. Again, as we said, to the extent of the former empire. And unfortunately, countries like Finland and Poland were part of that Tsarist empire. So it seems normal and natural in Moscow that they should be under Russian domination. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov has referred to them just in the last few days as being, the Russian word is bezkhoznie, and it's been translated into English as orphaned. But really, a better translation would be masterless, not having a master, not having somebody dominating them after the end of the Warsaw Pact. And that is when Russia says NATO stepped in when Russia was in a position of weakness to become the new master. Again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of exactly how NATO works and of the free will of those countries in between that want to join NATO precisely to be protected against Russia. Now, as Jamie said,
so can I ask you this? Sorry to interrupt, but time is my enemy on this program. So yesterday, after the NATO-Russia meeting, Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, called on Russia to take its troops out of Georgia, Ukraine, also Moldova. Is Russia going to listen to that at all?
Not at all. And unfortunately, the current US position seems to be making it worse in a number of different ways. Partly by buying into this conversation that Russia wants to have between the great powers over the heads of the people in between. The message that's coming from the US is do not escalate in Ukraine, but it should be a different one. It should be you do not have the right to dictate to these other countries that are now sovereign and independent how they should manage their affairs. And furthermore, this should not be a conversation between the great powers. Now, over and above that, we have to remember that for Finland in particular, those incremental benefits of joining NATO would actually be a great deal less than a country like, for example, Ukraine, because as Henri explained, Finland would be a security provider. It's one of the very few countries that maintained its strong defensive capacity, in part because it was outside NATO to start with. So outside NATO was being a benefit as opposed to countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, which were weak to start with and therefore needed NATO for protection in a way that Finland needs less so. And that brings us back to the nature of that Article 5 guarantee.
If only we had all the time in the world. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to Henri because you are in Finland. I'm going to go to you for the last word on this. An election next year. Is there a chance that a party could come to power that would be far more interested in joining NATO than the current one, led by, I believe, the world's youngest prime minister?
It's of course a possibility. There are a couple of parties in Finland, namely the National Coalition Party and the Swedish-speaking People's Party, who advocate for a NATO membership. But then again, as we all probably here are familiar, Finland has for a long time promoted that it has a NATO option, and it refers to the idea of Finland being able to make the decision to apply for NATO membership. And in practice, it has been used as a foreign policy instrument to deter Russia, meaning that if Russia weakens Finland's security, it will seek a new ways to strengthening it. And this NATO option was also recently confirmed by the President of Finland in his New Year's speech, and it has also been confirmed to Finland many times throughout the following weeks by Stoltenberg, for example, and President Biden. But your question is that what I'm trying to say here is that we have parties that support NATO membership openly, but then again, it's a coalition government. And in this sense, usually the consensus has been that every party is able to accept the NATO option policy. And this is sort of a compromise of a coalition government. And I think this will also be potentially the approach by the next government as well. I think it has been remained quite stable in this sense for
we will
years.
see in 2023. I'm sorry to cut you short, but time is my enemy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Helsinki, from Scotland, and from the UK. Much appreciated. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, that's all we have time for today. Until the next time you join us, which I hope you will do, goodbye.